Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. One thing that comes up again and again in the Buddhist teaching in various different contexts is the idea of middle path. The first use of the term or the idea middle path occurred in the Buddha's very first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which was principally about the Four Noble Truths, but he began the sermon with a statement about taking the middle way, the middle path between the two extremes of self-mortification and sensory gratification. And this was in the context that he was speaking to the first 5 disciples who had accompanied him in his quest when he was a bodhisattva seeking full enlightenment. He and these other 5 had practiced many kinds of ascetic yoga and tapas, practices that were prevalent in India: extreme fasting, holding uncomfortable postures for long periods of time, various other kinds of self-mortification. And the Buddha came to reject these as fruitless. But he also rejected what he called the dusty, crowded life of the village, which he called low, ignoble, base, which is the life of seeking after sensory indulgence. And he preached the middle way, the middle path, and this was the first statement or underlying ethic of the Sangha. The order that the Buddha set up is not based on self-mortification, and it's also based on avoiding the other extreme of sense pleasure and seeking the middle way. It may be a sign of how far our society has gone into hedonism that the life of a Buddhist monk now seems to many people to be an extreme asceticism. But in ancient India, the Buddhist Sangha was often criticized by, for example, the Jains as being indulgent because they didn't practice extreme fasting and all these other mortifications. So the middle way here in the first instance was the middle way between asceticism and hedonism, finding a balanced life that seeks out neither self-punishment nor self-gratification. Another later use of the term middle path was in relation to view. When the Buddha spoke about various wrong views, various theories and teachings that were prevalent in India, he classified them as belonging to one of 2 extremes. He called them, in some places they're called the extreme views. There's the view of eternalism, sasatavada, and the view of annihilationism, uchedavada. And he cited his own view as being the middle way between the 2. And often this is given in the context of a preface to teaching the dependent origination, the Paticca Samuppada. the dependent origination is based on the first principle of causation, that everything which occurs, everything which arises, is not by chance, not random, but arises according to cause and condition. It's the cornerstone or the foundation stone. Much of Buddhist philosophy is the importance of the principle of causality. The two extreme views are denied because they, at some point, reject the principle of causality. The eternalist view, Sasadawada, is the view that human beings have an immortal, everlasting, unchanging essence that the Indians called Atman or Jiva, and later in the West they might call it a soul, or psychologically an ego or a self. The idea that there is some unchanging essence, core principle of a being. And in both India and in the West, this doctrine usually went along with, almost always actually, went along with the idea of a creator God, the big soul or big Atman. But this view ends up rejecting the principle of causality in that things occur ultimately by the arbitrary will of a deity. In the West, even in the pre-Christian times, in Greek philosophy, they established the idea of a first cause, which of course later the Christians identified with God. But if there's a first cause, then that cause itself is causeless. So the principle of causality is broken down. This is why the Buddhists always felt that the universe, the world, was without beginning. Because any moment you identify in the past had to have a cause, so there had to be a previous moment. So there's no end to how far it can be traced backwards or forwards. The other extreme view, Uchedawada, is the view that in modern times we would call materialism or physicalism, the idea that human beings are entirely mechanical, biological machines, and that at death the human being is cut off absolutely. And this is why it's called the annihilation view, which Uchedawada means literally the cutting off view. Now this view also abandons the idea of causality at the critical point, because any individual person that exists, any being, had to have, always has a first moment in a life. So consciousness arises here without a cause, because there's no previous moment of consciousness. And there's an element of randomness. The other extreme is arbitrariness, but here causality is replaced by randomness, because there's no reason why a being is born in such a condition. Now, modern science knows a lot about biology and genetics, and can often explain how a being is born in a certain way, as one person might be born healthy and sound and good body and mind, and another person might be born with some crippling deformity, and they may be able to explain the mechanics of how that works, but they cannot answer the question why this one is born in such a condition and the other is born in a different condition. I think most of modern science would even say that's a meaningless question. But the Buddhist philosophy would say that there had to be a cause, and that cause being in previous karma made by that being in previous lifetimes. So the first consciousness that arises is not without cause. It's part of a stream, a continuum that begins in beginningless time. And the middle path between these two rejects randomness and rejects arbitrariness and seeks to understand all phenomena according to causes and conditions. And this ends up being the middle view. There's a metaphor for this that originated, I'm pretty sure, with Maurice Walsh, one of the translators of the Buddhist suttas. In one of his essays, he wrote about the middle view, and he compares it to if you have an island in the middle of a round lake. From either shore of the lake, the island looks closer to the further shore. And the approach of beings to the Buddhist teaching is like beings on the outside on the shore looking at the island. And those that are on the shore of the Susattavada, the eternalists, they look at Buddhism and they see, they don't believe in a God. They want to reduce everything to cause and conditions. They don't believe in an eternal soul. They're really very much like the scientific materialists. But if you go around to the other side of the lake, where the actual scientific materialists live, and they look at Buddhism in the middle, and they say, well, they believe in past lives, they believe in other realms, they do ceremonies and chanting. Really, it's not much different than any other religion. And this middle path view is actually, to maintain the middle path view is to some degree walking a tightrope or even a razor's edge. And historically we've seen again and again Buddhist schools and traditions that slide off one side or the other towards either a kind of nihilism or towards a something that approaches a theistic religion. To maintain that middle position requires a real deep understanding of emptiness and of the principle of anatta, of not self. Talking about middle path is related also to the idea of being in the middle or being centered or being balanced. And this comes up in a lot of the practical teachings, the application of mental development in Buddhist teachings. One of the commonly cited, very simple application of this principle is in the Buddha's talk to the musician Sona. Sona was a bhikkhu who in his lay life had been a musician, and he was having trouble with his meditation, and the Buddha counseled him, and he said, Sona, when you were playing your lute as a musician, you had to tune it, did you not? He said, yes, I did, Lord. He said, what happened if you tune the strings too tightly, well, there's a good chance they would break. What happened if you tune the strings too slack? Then you wouldn't get any kind of good sound out of them. So there was a whole skill in tuning the lute strings exactly right, not too tense and not too loose. And the Buddha said, so it is with your meditation. You have to train the mind to be not too tight and not too loose. You have to find that sweet spot, that simple middle way between the extremes of overexertion and the extreme of laxity. When the meditation is going perfectly in this way, there's a state that has been called diligent effortlessness. I've also heard it called undistracted non-meditation. The meditation is going perfectly, but there's no sense of making an effort or even of meditating. The mind is just perfectly at ease, but it doesn't miss a thing, and it doesn't wander. But there's no sense of strain or effort. That's a very delicate position to reach, and that's the whole skill and art of tuning the lute of strings of the mind. More detailed exposition of this principle is found in two of the lists of factors, the list of faculties and the list of enlightenment factors. The faculties, the indriya, are 5, and they come in 2 pairs that are to be balanced, and one in the middle that's mindfulness, or sati, that always remains in the center and is needed at all times. When you are in a state of mindfulness, when you have sati, then you are centered, you're balanced. Sati is generally now translated as mindfulness, but some of the older books translated it as recollectedness, and I think that is in some ways better, because it means being present in the here and now, being fully awake. So you're knowing the context, you know who you are, where you are, what you're doing. You're not confused. There's a link here with memory, because the Sanskrit equivalent word is smriti, which is the word for memory. And in the Pali texts, when someone is praised as being mindful, or satimant, having mindfulness, it's often stated as a descriptor. It's stated, he is mindful, he remembers well what was said and done long ago. So sati has this sense of the continuity of consciousness, that the mind is not confused and bewildered and lost. And when you're mindful, things are put into memory, they're registered. So mindfulness is in the middle, like the fulcrum of a balance beam, and the other factors, the other faculties are energy and samadhi as one pair, and faith and wisdom as the other pair. Energy and samadhi are the factors that are particularly related to meditation, and they're the tuning of the lute string. If your meditation is not going well, if it's difficult, it's usually in one of 2 ways. Either you're restless, you cannot be still, the mind cannot be quiet, or you're dull and sleepy and lazy and nodding off. And these are signs, falling into these two opposite states are signs of unbalanced faculties. If you're restless, unable to be quiet mentally or still physically, it's a sign of a lack of samadhi. Samadhi is stillness, it's stability. It's the mind resting in place, filled with the object of meditation. But if the meditator is dull and sleepy, then that's a sign of a lack of energy. Virya. Energy is the power, the motive, the driving force of a being. And if that's low, then the tendency is to fall into sleepiness. And at that time, what's needed is to energize. Which could be as simple, if it's a mild case, you're falling into a bit of dullness, it might be helpful to, first of all, straighten the posture. And could try meditating with eyes open, try doing more walking meditation, and so on, to energize. And what's not required at that time is to try and deepen your samadhi, because that will be counterproductive. Oppositely, if you're falling into restlessness, then you do need to cultivate more samadhi, because the samadhi that's weak and energy has gotten out of balance with it. So you've fallen out of the middle way, you've tightened the lute string too tight. So what's required in that case is stillness, physical and mental stillness. The only way to deal with restlessness is to subdue it by stillness. It's never overcome by appeasing it. The other pair of the faculties is wisdom and faith, saddha and panya. And this is a more broad category, not so much related to the immediate moment of meditation, but the general approach to the life and the teachings. There must be both faith and wisdom. Faith without wisdom becomes superstitious. And wisdom, and here we mean discriminating wisdom, without faith becomes cunning. And the mind develops to be skeptical and cynical. So these two must be balanced and stay in the middle. The 7 bojjhangas, the enlightenment factors, work in the same way. There's sati in the middle, and there's 2 pairs of 3 factors, energizing and tranquilizing factors. The energizing factors are, again, virya, also dhammavicaya, investigation of dhammas, and piti, joy or rapture. And the tranquilizing factors are passaddhi, tranquility, equanimity, and again samadhi. And the Buddha used the metaphor of keeping a fire going. If you're trying to keep a steady, nice fire going, if it's starting to go out, then you want to throw in a bunch of dry sticks and kindling and bark. But if it's blazing up way too hot, then you want to throw in green sticks and grass and things that'll damp it down. So you watch the mind and see whether it needs energizing or tranquilizing, and you apply the factors that are required at that time. And that's staying in the middle. That's being balanced. Perhaps the most or the deepest meaning of being centered, being in the middle, is being centered in the knowing mind, in the chitta. And this is something talked about a lot in the Thai forest tradition. It's the basis for much of the teachings of Ajahn Mahabua, for example. Being in the center with the knowing mind. All the activity of mind is peripheral to that. So all the thinking, the emotions, the fears and desires, the pleasures and pains, these are external to the knowing mind, the chitta, the pure awareness, which knows all these things but is not affected by them. So when you're centered in the knowing mind, in the chitta, which is the ultimate kind of centering, then you're bright, awake, you're fearless, you're not affected by changing conditions or circumstances. Because the chitta can neither be purified nor defiled. It's too simple, it's too immediate, it's just a presence, the awareness. There's the Zen story of the two monks debating about the nature of mind. And one of them says, the mind is a bright mirror set up in a high place, and it illuminates and reflects the 10,000 things. And the other monk says, that's not quite right. The mind is like a bright mirror set up in a high place that illuminates the 10,000 things, but nothing is reflected in the face thereby. A practical application of this principle in Vipassana meditation is the state of Tatra Majjhatthata, which even in its name it mentions middleness. Majja is middle, as in Majjhima Nikaya. Tatra is that, and atta is a suffix that means state of. So Tatra Majjhatthata is the state of being in the middle about that being the object of awareness at that moment. This is considered a form of equanimity or upekkha. And this is the natural state. If one is centered in the chitta, then one will be equanimous and clear about the objects, because there's no identification, there's no grasping, there's no fear or fascination. There's simply knowing. This purity of knowing from the middle, and not being caught and lost in the periphery. You can think of the mind as like a tornado. There's all this stuff whirling around. Have you ever seen the movie of Wizard of Oz, when the tornado hits Dorothy's house in Kansas, and there's all like houses and barns and cows and things spinning around and around? But right at the center of the tornado is the eye of the storm, is dead peaceful, dead calm. And from there one can sit and see everything swirling around. But one is at peace, not affected. But if you take an interest and identify with something that's rushing by in the storm, and you go and grab onto it, then you're caught in the turmoil as well. You're off center, you're lost, you're in the periphery. And it may take some time to find your way back to the center. So a lot of the practice, the real heart and core of the practice is being in the center.